So we're in that time in the Jewish year when Yom Kippur is over and it's still the month of Tishrei. To quote our amazing cantor, Dale Schatz, this is when the holiday season really begins. Maybe that's just from the clergy perspective, but I happen to agree with his perspective. Now, for those of you who were here when I was teaching on Erev Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Hashanah Day 2, I was talking about the liturgy of the high holidays and how unique and complicated it is. It turns out the secret is the liturgy of Sukkot is just as complicated. On the one hand, it's not as lengthy, but on the other hand, it's far less appreciated and known about by the Jewish community at large. Not as many people show up for Sukkot as the number of people who show up for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But if you've ever been in Israel for Sukkot, you know that the way the calendar really works is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are just preparing us for Sukkot. They help us clean out of the schmutz of the past year, and Sukkot is our holiday par excellence, the season specifically designed for us to rejoice. After all, in the agricultural cycle, the harvest is complete. It's time to celebrate a job well done. But for those of us who are outside Israel and maybe living in a big city, it's easy to finish Yom Kippur and get swept right back up in the secular year. And so those of us in shul today are giving ourselves a gift, the gift of leaning into the fullness of our holiday season, of our holiday month, and that's pretty cool. So kol hakavod to you too joining us virtually. Now here's another thing about this season that we might miss, that we might not be aware of. Most of us know we'll soon be celebrating Simchat Torah. That's the holiday when we finish reading the Torah and begin reading the Torah again. And most of us have probably noticed this but haven't fully appreciated it, but we focus way more on the beginning of the Torah than on the end. The beginning of the Torah is pretty cool. It's also highly structured. It enumerates the beginning of the world and how God created the world in neatly organized days from 1 to 6, of course resting on the 7th. And the end of the Torah is definitely not as easy to follow. And I'll admit, I didn't fully appreciate this until about a week ago, of course, in weekly warm-up Torah study. This is the gathering in which my plan is always, I'm going to teach a class about the Torah portion of the week. And the reality is that I learn from my students at least as much and probably more than I have to teach, so it works out well for me. It was last week that we were studying Parashat Vayelech. That's the parasha that becomes immediately before this week's parasha, Parashat Ha'azinu. And often Vayelech is read as a combined portion, combined with that previous parsha Nitzavim. Nitzavim has a lot of really cool stuff in there, but this year Vayelech was read on its own, and so we looked at it very closely. And so it turns out the end of the parsha goes something like this. If you want to follow along with your eyes as well as your ears, you can turn to page 1179, your Eitz Chaim Chumash. 1179 in the Eitz Chaim Chumash. That is chapter 31, verse 30 of the book of Deuteronomy. And reading an English translation, then Moses recited the words of this poem to the very end in the hearing of the whole congregation of Israel. So we're on page 1179 in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, those of us following the text. And we can see on that page, the sentence ends with a colon. And it's the end of the parsha. That's like the last thing on the page. So it's beyond cliffhanger. It's confusing. And one of my students asked a very great question. What poem? Where is this poem? Where would we look to find the poem that they're talking about? And I was like, well, yeah, of course it's confusing. I get it. It's just like the beginning of the next parsha. It's Parashat Ha'azinu, which is this week's parsha. If you were to look at the text in the Torah scroll, it would just keep going and it would make sense. And my student was a little bit skeptical that this made sense. And so I tried to explain, well, I know where to look because I've read this before. Of course, everybody knows. Not everybody knows. You turn to page 1185. So from 1179 directly to 1185 makes perfect sense. Where this week's parasha begins, Parashat Ha'azinu, and that's where you find the poem. So now the situation was like starting to make a little bit more comprehensibility out of it. But after the study session, I was thinking, these last parshas of the Torah, they really are confusing. And we don't really ever take a look at them because we're so busy with the high holidays. And then all of a sudden Simchat Torah is here and we're reading Parashat Bereshit, which is so full of interesting detail that we never have enough time to talk about it. And meanwhile, we still don't really know what's going on with these last few parshas of the Torah. But never fear, we're going to take a look at them right now. We're going to start with last week's parasha, Vayelech. We'll continue with this week's parasha, Ha'azinu, and we'll conclude with the last parsha of the Torah, V'zot HaBracha, which is read on Simchat Torah. And don't worry, they're not that long. This will happen in a reasonable amount of time. So here we go. And what we're going to do is something that we do every week in our weekly warm-up Torah study. We're going to use the outline on our Eitz Chaim Chumash. So I recommend, if you want to follow along with your eyes as well as your ears, that you turn now to page 1173, and that's the beginning of Parashat Vayelech, page 1173. I want to make sure to give people time if they want to follow along with their eyes, which I always recommend. And so when we're turning to page 1173, we see that there's commentary on the bottom of the page. There's the above-the-line commentary and the below-the-line commentary. Those are the technical terms that we always use. They have more special names. We can get to that later. But so we see in the above-the-line commentary, the epilogue, Moses' last days. And it gives a chapter selection. Chapter 31, verse 1 through chapter 34, verse 12. It spans the three parshiot we're going to look at today, Vayelech, Ha'azinu, and Vazot HaBracha. And we'll go through all this text using the outline headings. Okay, so we have preparing for new leadership, because every good leader needs a succession plan. That's part of what good leadership is planning for the next chapter. And so we have the same page, 1173, Moses' departure and replacement. Then we turn the page. We've got Moses appoints Joshua. It's clearly delineated that Joshua is the successor, which minimizes drama, which we love. Then we have in the same page 1174, writing and reading the teaching. This one can raise a lot of curiosity. We know that Moses received the Torah from God at Mount Sinai. Moses writes it down so future generations can have access to God's revelation. So we'll continue for now, page 1175. We can always say more on each one of those headings, but we kind of, we just get the overview first. So God meets with Moses and Joshua, page 1175. This seals the deal. Turning the page, we have countering Israel's future apostasy. We know that Israel will, in the future, not hold to the terms of God's covenant. That is, we won't do all the mitzvot. Shocking, I know, it's a growing edge. So then we have the subheadings within that. Israel's betrayal, page 1176. Writing a poem, page 1177, and that poem, now that's a foreshadowing of this week's parsha, Parshat Ha'azinu. Then we turn the page to 1178. We have God appoints Joshua, woohoo, we did it, succession plan achieved. And then, page 1178, we have conveying both the teaching and the poem, which leads us into this week's parsha, Parshat Ha'azinu. And so now we turn ahead to page 1185. Page 1185. That's the first page of this week's parasha, so we've seen this before today. We're still continuing with the section Moses' last days, but now we're getting a new headline section or heading section, Moses' poem. So after a brief introduction to the poem, we have the history of God's relationship with Israel, which begins on page 1185. Then that continues for a while, so we turn a couple of pages. Now we're on 1189, page 1189. We have God decides to punish Israel. On the one hand, kind of harsh. On the other hand, we've never been that good at doing all the mitzvot. It's a growing edge. Okay, so we continue. God decides to limit retribution. That's page 1190. And God decides to limit retribution. And it struck me, that's really an amazing thing. And that's really what Yom Kippur is all about. I was thinking about this yesterday, and I thought for the first time, we might not do that great of a job at all the apologizing and forgiving we're supposed to do from year to year. Your mileage may vary, but the holiday feels good anyway. Why is that? And so on the holiday of Yom Kippur, we affirm God decides to limit retribution, that God's forgiveness is possible, that God's forgiveness exists. It's a thing in the world. We do our apologies on behalf of the entire Jewish people. Maybe we apologize on behalf of all humanity. I imagine our beliefs on that are going to vary a little bit. And every year, God forgives us. Yom Kippur affirms that this world is not a place where you mess up once and it's all over. On the contrary, this world is a place where you can mess up time and time again and still be forgiven. And that's just remarkable. All right, let's continue. So we got our subheadings, page 1191. God decides to punish the enemy. God's plan to deliver Israel. Punishing the enemy, we probably have some differences of opinion, but delivering Israel, we love that one. Turning the page. We're celebrating Israel's deliverance, page 1193. And then we have our major outline heading, conclusion to the poem, page 1193, conclusion to the poem. And then the subheading on page 1194, God summons Moses to his death, which is very sad. It's very sad. I imagine I wasn't the only one who was sad in hearing this read this morning. And we have an appreciation looking at this and remembering what it was like to hear this end of this parsha read today. We have an appreciation for why Vazot HaBracha, the last parsha in the Torah, the parshas where Moses does actually die, isn't really part of this regularly scheduled Shabbat Torah reading rotation. It's really very sad. I'll never forget, this was many years ago now, I was celebrating Simchat Torah in San Francisco, and I heard the chanting of the Torah describing Moses' death on Simchat Torah, and the Torah reader cried. It was just an unforgettable moment. And so we're going to learn this parsha together now. V'zot habracha. We turn ahead now to page 1202. And so we have the heading, Moses' farewell blessings. We've got an introduction, then we've got another poem. Quick sidebar, I think another part of why we don't learn these parshiot that often is that they're poetic, and poetry isn't necessarily easy even in a language that we speak fluently. And all the more so, it's challenging in a language that we don't speak fluently. And even for those who do speak fluent Hebrew, it's not exactly contemporary Hebrew either. There's a lot of challenges going on, but we'll at least take some notice that we start to look at page 1202 and 1203, and we see that we have blessings tribe by tribe. Now this is similar. Someone besides me is thinking about this right now. This is similar to what we see in the last parsha of the book of Genesis. So let's take a moment and take a look at that really briefly. We're not going to go all the way down the rabbit hole, but we hold the page right here and we turn back to page 298. Page 298, which is only a 3-digit number. It's way at the beginning. So page 298, these are similar but not the same. So we've got the Testament of Jacob, the prose introduction, and then the poem, and it kind of goes tribe by tribe. And not in the same order, it's similar but not the same. Like I said, we're not going to go all the way down that rabbit hole today, at least not today. Simchat Torah will be a whole other moment. We'll cross that bridge if and when we come to it. Okay, so we're going to bring it in, turn it back to page 1203. Hopefully we held the page so it's just easy. Okay. And so we've got some tribal blessings. Okay, we've got Reuben and Judah, page 1203. Turn the page. We've got Levi, page 1204. Benjamin and Joseph, page 1205. Turn the page. We've got Zebulun and Issachar, page 1206. Gad, page 1207. Turn the page. Page 1208, we've got Dan, Naphtali, and Asher. And then page 1208, we have the coda, the concluding passage. And then, so that goes into page 1209. And page 1210, we have the death of Moses. We know this is sad. On page 1211, we have the people's mourning and Joshua's succession to leadership. And then we have the eulogy, page 1212. The eulogy. And let's just look in detail at two things on this page. We've got the first line in Hebrew, Lo kamna vi od beYisrael kamoshe. And so we actually find that line echoed in a piyut called Yigdal. We don't say this piyut that frequently here at Adat Shalom, but it's an awesome piyut. It's kind of like Adon Olam. And there the line is rephrased, and it goes, Lo kam beYisrael kamoshe od. You know that one? So this line is remembered in a whole different piyut that is many places in the Siddur. And so this idea that never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses. Moses was absolutely one of a kind. And so when we think about the loved ones that we've lost, it's moving and it's also relatable. And then the last line, actually the last letter in the last line, it's a lamed. And then if we were to turn all the way back to the front of the Torah, which we don't have to do right now, we know the first word of the Torah is Bereshit, which starts with a bet. And so we have this drash that the Torah ends with a lamed and starts with a bet, and lamed bet spells lev, heart. So the Torah is our heart. And as we conclude our learning, it's a special time of year. May all of us continue to hold in our minds and our hearts the memories of all those we love and we love still who are no longer alive. Reading the death of Moses reminds us of that in a way. And so as we move forward from this Shabbat to our Sukkot holiday, may we shake the lulav, sit in the sukkah, and celebrate the season of our joy in their honor and in their memory. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach.